few lessons ago we learned about convention routing, and we saw how routes were added to a collection of routes called a route table through the use of this map route method on that collection of routes. And so the route table, we said, was basically just a collection of routes that are used to evaluate all incoming URLs to route them to the correct controller and action result method that will handle them, or in the formulation of outgoing URLs that will be emitted through the response stream into the HTML that's spit out. In MVC 5, version 5, attribute routing was introduced as a second way of adding route definitions to that route table, that collection of routes. And so the benefit of using attribute routing is that you're able to define the routes using attributes, square bracket attributes, on action result methods. And so you can modify routes near the destination of the route. In other words, the route definition is in close proximity to the action result method, not relegated to another file in another folder way off in another part of our project. Okay, so as we said in that lesson on customizing routes, in convention routing, the information about which URL to use to call into a controller is kept in a completely different file from the controller itself. So a developer has to look in both the controller and in the routeconfig.cs in order to understand how to call into that controller. Furthermore, it forces you to encode action-specific information like parameter names and things of that nature into a global route table instead of keeping it kind of all bundled up in where it belongs in one spot. So an attribute-based approach solves several problems by allowing you to configure how an action gets called and right on the action itself. In some cases, this might improve the usability and make it simpler to build and maintain your routes. So keep in mind that you can actually mix and match these techniques. You can use convention routing for a majority of the cases and then rely on attribute routing whenever you get into a pickle. Or you can abandon convention routing altogether and just go straight with attribute routing, but keep in mind the result is basically the same. You're simply adding routes to the route table. Okay, and there's no real easy way to present this material, so I'm going to go through it in a rapid fire pace, kind of adding something and then deleting it. So don't worry, we're going to add a lot of these ideas to a cheat sheet. Just focus on understanding what's possible, what you can do, and then you can use a reference like the web or like the cheat sheet to find what you need to do in specific instances. Also, take a look at this particular URL. This is probably the best place to go to learn everything you ever need to know about attribute routing. And so in a lot of ways, this video is nothing more than a compilation or a condensation of the ideas that are talked about here in this blog post. Okay? So let's go ahead and minimize that. And let's go ahead and get started. And what we want to do is actually comment out this default route. And what we're going to do is actually below it go routes.map MVC attribute route. So what this will do is enable attribute routing in our application. Okay? So that's step number one. Then what we can do is go to our home controller and just work from there from that point on. Pretty cool. All right, so the first thing that I want to do is to define an entire route inside of an attribute. So I'm going to go right here, and on top of this index method, I'm going to use the route attribute. And inside of you can see that there's several different ways to call into this, and we'll go through a couple of these through this video. But say, for example, I want this route to be product/index on this home controller's index action result method. Now, a couple things to note here. First of all, notice that we're defining the entire route here in an attribute. And furthermore, the route does not have to match the name of the controller. Okay, and admittedly, we didn't have to do that in convention-based routing either, but this gives you a little bit more granularity of control, again, at the method level. So if we were to run the application, you can see that we don't really get the satisfaction that we want because we haven't set a default route. We'll get to that in a little bit. But let's go products/index, and hopefully we can see the home controller's index method, and we can. Okay, and I don't really have any data filled in here, so you're not going to see any data in this. You're just going to see the page headings, and that will tell you that we're in the right spot. Okay. So the next thing that we'll want to do is actually pass in parameters, and so I'm going to do that down here in this next action result method called details. And so again, I'm going to go route, and then inside of here, what I want to do is go products slash, and then I'm going to use the open and close curly braces and use the pattern parameter called ID that will match up with the ID that we expect to be passed into the details method. Okay, so now we should be able to do something like slash products /1. Okay, and again, we just go to the details page. We don't have the data for number 1. I didn't bother going through all that, but you can see how that works. Okay. Furthermore, you can use optional parameters, and so in this case, I'm going to go ahead and add an optional parameter called name, and you just add it by again using that pattern parameter syntax, give it the name of the identifier of the parameter, and then use a question mark afterwards. So in this case, we would expect to do something like this: string name. Okay, and passing both of those into details. All right, so actually constraints are a little bit easier. What you can do with constraints is just do a colon after the identifier for your pattern parameter, and then type in the constraint itself. And there's a bunch of different constraints. This one will force you to only use integers as the IDs in your product/ID route. Okay, and here's another example on screen right now that you can see where we have a fictitious example of for comment. So in this case, we pass in the ID. It will be alphanumeric or just alpha characters /comments. That'll be routed to the action result method called comments in this particular case. So the route would be something like /product/ Basquirk, or whatever the name of the product is, /comments, and that would go to the comments action result method. All right, and here again you want to take a look at this page because it has that listing of a bunch of the route constraints that you can apply, and there's a bunch of them that are built in here. Let me go down to this table, and you can see we've already used the alpha constraint and the int constraint, but you can make sure that it's a bool, it's a date, time, decimal, so all these data types. You can also make sure that it matches with a maximum value of 10, or a minimum or maximum length of 10 characters, or a minimum value of 10, or a minimum length of 10, ranges, and then obviously regular expressions. They can all be used in the same fashion. Furthermore, a little bit later on that page, you can also see where you can apply multiple constraints by using the colon. So in this case, you can see that not only does the ID need to be an integer, but it also has to have a minimum value of 1. Okay. And it says here you can't use /user/0 because 1 is the minimum. All right. And then finally, just like before, you could create your own custom route constraints, and we said we weren't going to cover that in these videos, but you can do some interesting things that would allow you to restrict, for example, the values between like 2 potential values, either Celsius or Fahrenheit. Those are the only 2 values that could be used in that that last segment of the route for a given temperature. Okay. All right. So continuing on here, let's minimize that and go back into Visual Studio. You can also use a route prefix that applies to every single route inside of a given controller. So we can go up here and go route prefix. Right, and then we can just say, hey, everything in here, let's treat it with the prefix of products. And so that would eliminate our need to add that to the route. We could just remove it from there, and we could remove it from there as well, and it should all still work. Okay. What if we wanted to still put our action result method in this controller, but we don't want it prefixed with the products route? Well, you can kind of break out of that. You can override the route prefix by using an absolute path prefix. So let me go ahead and just add another attribute on top of this called route. And then this particular one, I want somebody to be able to go directly to /deals. So this won't be /product/deals. It'll just be, example.com/deals, and it will go to this deals method. Okay. Now earlier we saw that we tried to just go to the root of our domain, and we didn't get a default route. So we can specify the default route for the application by also using the absolute path prefix. We can also specify a default route for a given route prefix by passing in an empty string. So here let's go with add another route attribute on top of this one. So route, and then like I said, we're going to add that absolute path prefix like so, and that will make this a default route for the entire application. Or I can just do a empty string for the default route for this route prefix, so products. So let's start there, and so we'll go and run the application. Now obviously we're going to need to type in products here, so /product should take us to the index page. Great. Okay, so we don't have to type in /product/index like so. All right. But if we want it to be the default for the entire application, then again we can add this absolute path syntax, and so now it should default to our index page, and it does. Great. Very nice. I guess this also demonstrates the fact that you can add multiple route attributes to a single action result method for whatever purposes you might have. If you have multiple names that you want to use for a given route, you can do that. So there's one other way to define a default route for a given controller, and so I'm going to actually remove all the routes off of index and go up to the controller level, and here I'm going to add a route, and inside of the route I'm going to go action, whoops, I need the curly braces, action equals index. So now if you just go to the root, you'll still get a 404 or 403 in this case. However, if we were to go to products, then it would go to the index, right? So that's good. And finally, you can specify the name of a route and the order that it should be added to the route table in. And so we said named routes are sometimes important whenever you want to use some of the HTML helper methods to emit a URL using a specific route as the pattern, given all the route data that's passed along. So in order to do that, let's go ahead, and I'm actually going to remove this route attribute and go back to index here. And so we'll go route, and then one of the overloads, as you can see, is the template that we'll use and the name parameters. And so the template is the pattern, so in this case index, and then name parameters, here we'll go name equals products index, and then we'll set the order equals 2. Alright, and so now we have created or added a new route with the name of products index, and we can reference that in methods that require the name of a route. Okay, and we can do the same thing here in the details. We can go, in fact, let's go route, and we'll just give the route the ID, the name of the ID, or actually we'll create the pattern placeholder of ID, and then in a series of name parameters we want to set the name of this equal to product details, and then the order equal to 1. So in this particular case, this route would be evaluated before this route would, because the order is 1 here and the order is 2. Okay, so as you can see, you have a ton of options. Most of this video is a good candidate, again, for the cheat sheet because there's really too much to remember here. As I said at the outset, you could stick with convention-based routing for now and then introduce attribute routing whenever you face an exceptional case. And this would be a good example of that right here, and how easy it was just to break out of the typical routes that have been defined earlier, especially whenever we created a route prefix. Now, we're not completely done with routes just yet. Soon we're going to talk about areas, which will add another segment to the routes, so another concept to the mix of routes here. And areas will help us separate major sections of our application. But before we get to that, let's talk about filters. We'll see you there. Thanks.